Hi, welcome to this series of videos where we'll be discussing and reviewing some of the most relevant topics, some of the more complex topics as well from the course Fundamentals of Life. And this series of videos specifically focused on the biomolecules and the different characteristics, functions, and qualities that we need to know and have very clear for these four biomolecules that we have discussed previously in class. So in this first video, we'll talk more about the general aspects to consider about biomolecules from the fundamental point of view. When we're discussing about biomolecules, the first thing that we need to have or keep in mind is the aspect of the levels of organization. We've previously seen that atoms come together into making molecules, molecules come together into making cells, and cells, or a cell, is where basically life begins, is speaking of these levels of organization. So this topic basically explores which specific molecules are going to be in charge of actually building up what the cell is made up of. So every cell, probably you've seen this before in middle school, every cell is made up of different structures, and each structure would be made itself by 1, 2, 3, 4 biomolecules in different quantities and organizations. So these four biomolecules that make what we call a cell, and any type of cell for that matter, we're going to be discussing about this particular four biomolecules that you see on screen. So we're having carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. 3 out of these 4 biomolecules, we actually get them from food. So basically our diets, our digestive systems will be in charge of getting these molecules from our food and putting them into our cells so that the cell can continue to build and grow and develop and make its own functions to continue to be a living thing. Nucleic acid, different from the other 3, will be more in charge about everything that has to do with the genetic information. And in this chapter, the idea is to basically get a glimpse or get a general introduction to all these molecules that we're discussing. But in the second partial, we'll be discussing more in detail everything related to nucleic acids and genetic information. Yep. So in general, when we discuss, let me just move this one here. When we discuss the biomolecules, we need to keep in mind 2 words basically that are helping to describe size of these molecules. So we said before we have 4 biomolecules, which is carbohydrate, lipid, proteins, and nucleic acids. These big molecules, they are made up of very large molecules. They're made up of smaller units, pretty similar to the same idea that we have, for example, a Lego toy, that when you have all the individual pieces, they probably don't make much sense. They're like rectangles, squares, cubes. They're individual pieces that by themselves are geometric figures. But when you start putting them all together and start linking stuff between them, you will have higher levels of complexity, in the sense that these pieces start to come together to make a shape or to make a structure, like a castle or a starship or like a car or whatever, right? So like most Legos function with this principle. You have a lot of these small pieces coming together to build more complex figures. It's pretty much the same in here, where we have small units. In this case, they're called monomers. It's an individual unit that you start putting it together with other monomers into building these very large structures that have a particular shape and have a particular function, which are called the polymers. So this is pretty much a concept that applies to all 4 biomolecules. So when we talk about lipids, nucleic acids, carbohydrates, and proteins, we're talking about the big picture, the final representation of these molecules. These are 4 polymers. These are the big picture. But when we study them even smaller, like individual units for all of this, then we need to discuss also their names, the names of each individual monomer, or also known as these small pieces. And the first step is basically knowing the names for each of them. So we're going to see them individually. So for example, we have here nucleic acids. Their monomers, or their individual piece that you start putting it together, is called a nucleotide. For carbohydrate, is called a monosaccharide. For the lipid, we're going to focus as the monomer being the fatty acid, which is the main, let's say, the main monomer when we're talking about specific type of lipids, mainly triglyceride. So we're going to take fatty acid as the monomer of lipids. And for proteins, we're going to have amino acids. Now, already here on screen, between the polymers, which are the big molecules on the top, and the monomers, which is the individual units that are on the bottom, there's already very similar aspects to them, which might actually confuse you. So nucleic acid, fatty acid, and amino acid, all three of these include acid within their names. So it's very often very common to start to mix them or to confuse them. So start over there, right? Try to distinguish between these words so you don't get confused later when trying to recall this information or trying to, like write down an explanation regarding these things. So again, to insist, monomers are basically these units that by themselves mean something. By themselves, there are molecules, but they get an even a higher function or a more complex function if they start to work together, to join forces into what we call a polymer, right? So we have 4 polymers, which is the nucleotide, fatty acid, amino acid, and monosaccharide. And we have 4 polymers so far, which is carbohydrate, protein, lipid, and nucleic acid. So again, these units of monomers coming together, they make a larger unit, just as these skydivers in here. When they like join hands, each of them individual has their own, let's say, function, purpose, identity, but coming together, they make, let's say, a more relevant or a more show-off, in this case, scenario, which would be the function of this larger molecule that we call a polymer. So in this series of videos, the next videos will go individually for each of the biomolecules that we will study, which is 4. But first we're going to focus on the ones that we can actually find in food, which is carbohydrate, lipid, and protein. This in particular because we'll have special relevance later next semester when we go into health and society, when we talk about digestive system, nutrition, and certain conditions, health conditions, where the lack or excess or different intakes of these particular monomers or food sources that contain these protein, carbohydrate, and protein, carbohydrate, and lipids, they would be included for your characteristics of life, which includes metabolism, growth, and development. So in the next videos, we'll discuss individually, like carbohydrates and their function, proteins function, lipids structure and function. And so please feel free to watch specifically the video that you feel more interested about, and let me know if you have any question. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in class.